911, where's your emergency?
I need someone to come out here to my house.
2 bullets, 1 body, a 911 call delivered with ice in the veins. Tiffiney Crawford wasn't just a mother or a wife. She was a community leader, a force of light, until that light was suddenly extinguished in the dead of night. They said it was suicide. Her husband played the grieving act. The police shrugged, and the system almost let it slide. But not here. On this channel, we're not here to sugarcoat, speculate, or recycle headlines. We're here to rip the cover off the narrative. You thought you knew this case, but you only knew the version they let you hear. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth. On a quiet night in May 2017, the town of Cullman, Alabama, was like any other sleepy southern community. Families were settling in, children were asleep, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Until a 911 call shattered the calm. Jason Crawford was on the line. His voice was composed, eerily composed. He claimed his wife, Tiffiney Crawford, had just shot herself outside their home, twice, with her non-dominant hand. And just like that, a tragic story began unraveling. But what if the story wasn't what it seemed? What if the truth had been quietly sitting in the dark all along, waiting to be discovered? 5 years later, that same man, Jason Crawford, would stand before a jury, accused of murdering the woman he claimed to love. The case of Tiffiney Crawford's death became more than a family tragedy. It became a haunting puzzle of grief, betrayal, and a justice system forced to reckon with its own blind spots. This is not just another true crime story. It's a story about what happens when the people closest to you are the ones you should fear most. On the night of May 2nd, 2017, at just after 11 p.m., Jason Crawford made a call that would change everything. "I heard a shot, a scream, and then another shot," he told the dispatcher. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they found Tiffiney Crawford slumped in the driver's seat of her van. A pink revolver lay near her left hand. She had been shot twice in the head. From the beginning, the story raised eyebrows. 2 shots? Using her non-dominant hand? Still, officers on the scene leaned toward a conclusion that would follow the case like a shadow: suicide. It didn't help that Jason's mother, Rhonda Crawford, worked for the local sheriff's department. That alone would make any outsider question the objectivity of the early investigation. And perhaps in hindsight, that's where the first misstep occurred. The vehicle, the very place where Tiffiney died, was released to the family less than 24 hours after her death, and it was cleaned by Jason's relatives. Any chance at preserving untouched forensic evidence was gone. Why the rush? The sheriff later insisted that every piece of relevant evidence had already been gathered. But to the trained eye of state investigator Joe Parrish, something didn't sit right. So the case was turned over to the Alabama State Bureau of Investigation. And the first thing they noticed? There was no blood on the inside of the driver's door, none on the window, none on the glass, which raised a disturbing question. If the door was closed when Tiffiney shot herself, where was the blood? And if it was open, then who was standing on the other side? As investigators dug deeper, the inconsistencies began to multiply. Tiffiney was right-handed. The gun was found in her left hand. She had been shot once in the jaw and once in the temple. 2 shots, both on the left side of her head. Forensic expert Dr. Valerie Green would later testify that the second shot, the one to the temple, had been fired from at least 10 inches away. That fact alone shattered the suicide narrative. In most self-inflicted gunshot cases, the barrel is placed directly against the skin. This wasn't just uncommon, it was mechanically implausible. Then there was the emotional context. Tiffiney's mother, Cheryl McGuckin, described her daughter as vibrant, driven, and full of life. She had just spoken to Tiffiney hours before the incident and had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Tiffiney wasn't just a mother, she was a community figure. She'd founded Mothers Helping Mothers, a support group that had spread across the country. She sang and danced with her kids. She talked about traveling. She had plans. But, as it turns out, she also had secrets. Jason told investigators that he had discovered Tiffiney was having an affair just hours before she died. He said he confronted her, refused to let her into the house, and then walked away. That's when, according to him, she ended her own life. But here's what doesn't add up. In his initial 911 call, Jason never mentioned the affair. Not once. Not even when he described the argument. That omission became critical to State Agent Joe Parrish, who would later say that Jason's voice on the call sounded too calm, too detached, as if he already knew how the story was going to end. The Alabama State Bureau of Investigation started over. They treated the case not as a suicide, but as a potential homicide. And slowly, piece by piece, the story began to crack. They re-examined the gun. The DNA was inconclusive. There was too little to say definitively who had handled it. But Dr. Green, the medical examiner, was certain. The angles, the distances, the lack of blood spatter inside the van, it all pointed to someone else pulling the trigger. Yet the defense had their own theory. Tiffiney was unraveling. They argued that she had been drinking heavily. She was upset about the affair. And most damning of all, she had started seeing a counselor just one day before her death. But the idea that she could shoot herself twice with her non-dominant hand at odd angles remained hard to sell. The case stalled. For nearly a year, there were no charges. Then came the autopsy report. Cause of death, gunshot wounds to the head. Manner of death, homicide. And just like that, the tide turned. With the autopsy ruling Tiffiney Crawford's death a homicide, the case was presented to a grand jury. And on May 21, 2018, just over a year after Tiffiney's death, Jason Crawford turned himself in. He was charged with murder. But this wasn't a slam dunk case. In fact, it was exactly the kind of case that divides juries, tears apart families, and keeps prosecutors awake at night. There was no direct physical evidence tying Jason to the shooting. No witnesses, no confession. Only a web of circumstantial details, inconsistencies, and one cold, unsettling truth. Tiffiney Crawford was dead, and the story surrounding her death was full of holes. Jason posted bond and walked free while awaiting trial. He insisted on his innocence. He maintained that Tiffiney had been overwhelmed, broken by her affair, and acted impulsively. But prosecutors weren't buying it, and neither were the investigators who had listened to Jason's 911 call again and again. It was one line in particular that began to haunt them. When the dispatcher asked where the gun was, Jason responded, "It's laying beside her." But that wasn't true. Body cam footage showed that the gun was in Tiffiney's hand when officers arrived, and only fell out when they tried to check her pulse. So why would Jason say it was beside her, unless he had seen it there? Unless, perhaps, he had placed it there. In November 2022, more than 5 years after Tiffiney's death, the trial of Jason Crawford began. The courtroom was tense. Jason's parents sat in the gallery. So did Tiffiney's mother, Cheryl, who had spent years caught in the emotional crossfire. She had continued to visit her grandchildren, had stayed civil with Jason's family. But now, seated just a few feet from the man accused of killing her daughter, her resolve was tested. She testified. She was the prosecution's first witness. On the stand, she admitted, for years, she didn't want to believe Jason could be capable of this. She hadn't demanded full access to case files. She didn't ask for every gruesome detail. Why? Because she didn't want to lose the only connection she still had to her daughter, her grandchildren. But the evidence was no longer just troubling. It was damning. Medical examiner Dr. Valerie Green explained to the jury that the angle of the gunshot to Tiffiney's temple, the absence of blood spatter, and the lack of a contact wound all suggested one thing. This was not a suicide. The prosecution built its case on these physical clues, on the failed polygraph, on the timing of the affair discovery, and on Jason's demeanor. The defense pushed back. They played a pre-recorded deposition from their own forensic expert, who believed the shooting could have been self-inflicted. And they reminded the jury, Jason had no prior violent history. He had remained friendly with his first ex-wife. He was the father of 3 children. But in the end, that wasn't enough. The jury deliberated. Some were hesitant at first. The case lacked the cinematic kind of proof. No fingerprints on the trigger, no eyewitness bursting through the courtroom doors at the last second. But the prosecution had planted seeds of doubt, and one moment seemed to water them all. It was the 911 call. Again, one juror said, "When we listened to that 911 call again, that was it." Jason's voice wasn't panicked. It was hollow. He did for help. He didn't cry out Tiffany's name. He didn't show any urgency. And crucially, he misrepresented the location of the gun. Was it a simple mistake made in shock? Or was it a script rehearsed too early? On November 18, 2022, Jason Crawford was found guilty of the murder of his wife Tiffany. The courtroom went quiet. For a moment, even those who had believed in his innocence sat stunned. Cheryl McGuckin later said she felt a strange numbness, a kind of justice wrapped in sorrow. "There's no justice here," she said. "Everybody loses." In March 2023, during Jason's sentencing, Cheryl returned to the stand. This time, she didn't speak as a witness. She spoke as a mother. Her voice trembled as she asked the question that had haunted her since the night Tiffany died. "How could you look me in the eye for 5.5 years if you had murdered my daughter?" Jason didn't answer. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Under Alabama law, he'll be eligible for parole in 15 years. 15 years before he could potentially walk free again. 15 years of silence that Tiffany will never speak through. But the damage is already incalculable. 3 children lost their mother. 2 of them lost their father as well. And for 5 years, a grieving family tried to make sense of a tragedy that was being spun into something it never was. Outside the courtroom, the story took on a second life. True crime forums exploded. Was Jason protected early on because of his mother's connection to the sheriff's office? Was the van intentionally released to the family so it could be cleaned, so that evidence would quietly vanish? Did law enforcement brush too close to bias before finally backing off? The theories spiraled. Some people insisted it was a cover-up. Others argued Tiffany had indeed ended her own life, and Jason was simply being punished because he didn't sound guilty enough. But the trial made one thing clear. In the eyes of the law, he was guilty. And while the public continues to dissect every frame of body cam footage, every transcript of court testimony, those closest to Tiffany are left with something far heavier than debate. They're left with absence. In the months following the verdict, the ripples of Tiffany's death kept spreading. Her support group, Mothers Helping Mothers, once a vibrant online community, became a space of mourning. Posts that once celebrated milestones now carried photos of candlelight vigils and quotes about grief. For those who had never met Tiffany in person, she was more than a founder. She was a symbol of resilience, motherhood, and hope. The tragedy of her death felt personal. Because Tiffany wasn't just someone on the news. She had written words of encouragement to strangers. She had danced with her kids on live streams. She had reminded mothers that they mattered on days when they truly didn't believe it themselves. And then she vanished. For Cheryl, Tiffany's mother, grief became a balancing act. She had to navigate life as both a grandmother and a survivor of a nightmare that seemed to reset every morning. In interviews, she confessed she had tried to keep her heart open, even when doubt started creeping in. She had trusted Jason, let him into her family, believed him when he cried, shared meals, trusted him with her grandchildren. Now she was haunted by a question that would follow her for the rest of her life. How much of that was real? Jason's attorneys argued that the entire case was built on perception. No fingerprints, no gunshot residue, no eyewitness, just behavioral assumptions and ambiguous forensics. And it's true, people grieve differently. Some scream, some fall apart. Some, like Jason, remain quiet, cold, calculated. But is that a sign of guilt, or just a reflection of someone who doesn't know how to show emotion? They also highlighted that Tiffiney had been going through emotional turmoil. Her affair had recently ended. She had started therapy the day before. She was reportedly drinking heavily, sometimes multiple bottles a week. Her marriage was falling apart. Could it be that she really had given up? But jurors weren't convinced, because emotion isn't the only form of evidence. Sometimes it's the absence of emotion that raises the loudest alarm. Tiffiney's children are now being raised by family, without their mother's voice and without their father's presence. They will grow up reading headlines about the trial, hearing whispers at school, and piecing together their own truths from the fragments adults try to shield them from. Cheryl has made it clear that she hopes to keep Tiffiney's memory alive, not as a victim, but as a woman who built something meaningful out of love. She continues to share Tiffiney's story in interviews. She visits her grandchildren. She smiles when she talks about how Tiffiney used to sing in the car or do spontaneous dances in the kitchen. Because in all the noise, all the debate, and all the courtroom drama, there was a person, a mother, a daughter, a light that should never have gone out. As the trial concluded and the cameras moved on, the true crime community latched onto the case like a lightning rod. YouTube videos dissected the 911 call frame by frame. Reddit threads turned into amateur detective forums. Podcasters speculated on whether Jason's voice was too calm or simply in shock. Facebook groups bloomed overnight, flooded with users who suddenly felt intimately connected to a family they had never met. Some were convinced Jason was guilty beyond doubt. Others claimed he was a scapegoat, collateral in a tragedy that no one fully understood. Some even went so far as to suggest conspiracy, that Tiffiney's death had been used to score political points or pad a prosecutor's resume. What should have been a quiet, local case about heartbreak and justice exploded into national conversation. Jason's family issued statements defending his innocence. Cheryl, still grieving, had to watch strangers on the internet question her daughter's mental health, her parenting, her marriage, everything. True crime had found a new obsession, but it came at a price. Tiffiney's children, now old enough to understand words like murder, will one day scroll past comments about their mother's last moments. They will hear theories about their father. They will listen to voices picking apart the past like a cold case file. For them, it isn't content, it's reality. At the core of this case lies a question that haunts all criminal justice. What does justice look like when it's delayed, when it's messy, when no one wins? Jason was convicted and sentenced to 99 years. But his demeanor, even after the verdict, sparked discomfort. He didn't cry, he didn't collapse, he didn't plead his innocence dramatically. He just stood there. Some called it stoicism, others called it sociopathy. Tiffiney's friends say that if she could speak now, she wouldn't scream for vengeance. She'd ask for protection, for her kids, for other women like her, caught in marriages that look perfect from the outside but carry storm clouds behind closed doors. Her journal, read during the trial, was a window into that storm. She had written about being overwhelmed, feeling unseen, trying to keep her family together while crumbling inside. But none of her words pointed to ending her life. They pointed to trying to survive it. Jason's defense team still argues that the jury saw what they wanted to see, that people project their expectations of grief, of guilt, of emotion onto a person and call it proof. But juries don't just vote on facts, they vote on what those facts mean. And in this case, they meant one thing: Tiffiney Crawford didn't pull the trigger. One of the most controversial aspects of this case wasn't the shooting, it was everything that happened after. The release of the van. The decision to let Jason's family clean the crime scene before a full investigation had concluded. the fact that Jason's mother worked for the sheriff's department. To many, those facts painted a picture of preferential treatment, whether intentional or not. The sheriff insisted the investigation was handled properly. He said the scene had been processed, evidence collected, photos taken, that nothing critical had been lost. But how do you prove what's not there anymore? What if blood on the van door would have told a different story? What if fingerprints had been wiped? What if the truth had been sitting in that van, quietly erased with a bottle of cleaner and good intentions? Sheriff Matt Gentry said they handed the case to state investigators for transparency. That's true, but only after key elements had already slipped through the cracks. In court, that choice became a quiet drumbeat behind every argument the prosecution made. If the evidence wasn't direct, it had to be persuasive. And that meant every piece, every inconsistency, every misstep mattered more. Because in the absence of a smoking gun, juries look for smoke. March 10th, 2023. Sentencing day. Cheryl McGuckin took the stand again. This time not as a mother holding back doubt, but as a mother who had finally let herself believe what she never wanted to. That Jason Crawford had murdered her daughter. She spoke for Tiffiney. She told the court that Tiffiney would never have imagined how far this pain would reach, that she would be heartbroken to know her children were growing up under the shadow of a courtroom verdict, that the woman who once sang in the car and created safe spaces for struggling moms had been reduced to a debate over trajectory angles and emotional flatness. Jason showed little emotion during sentencing. He remained composed, quiet, just like in the 911 call. He received 99 years. Not life without parole, but close. He'll be eligible for release after 15 years. By then, his youngest daughter will be in her 20s. The echoes of that night in May 2017 will have been repeated in courtrooms, classrooms, and late-night conversations more times than anyone can count. But Tiffiney will still be gone. In the end, this wasn't just a story about murder. It was about what people choose to see, what they miss, what they convince themselves to believe, because the alternative is too painful to bear. Jason Crawford may spend the rest of his life in prison, or he may walk free in 15 years. But no sentence will restore what was lost that night. No verdict can bring back the sound of Tiffiney's laughter, the chaos of her kitchen dancing, or the comfort she gave to hundreds of struggling mothers who saw themselves in her. The children she left behind will carry the weight of this story for the rest of their lives, not just because their mother is gone, but because the person accused of taking her away was supposed to be her safe place. There are no heroes in this story, only a woman who deserved better, a family torn in half, and a justice system that almost missed its chance to speak. True crime obsesses over the mystery, the forensics, the final twist. But the hardest part comes after, when the cameras leave, when the jurors go home, when the questions still linger. That's the part we rarely talk about. The aftermath, the silence.
So that's how crimes end, and if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you want me to do some special crimes in all over the world, comment down below, or you can send us direct through email, and I will see you in all my videos. See ya!